Among the nobility of the 18th century Sweden, a silent conspiracy lurks, shrouded in whispers and masked intentions. The Swedish king Gustav III harbors dreams of enlightenment and reform, and of a grand new Sweden. His court buzzes with whispers, loyalists plotting, and scheming nobles, and a mysterious figure lurking in the shadows. The air crackles with tension as the clock ticks toward the king's last moments alive. It is 1788, and King Gustav III rules over Sweden. Sweden's war with Russia is still ongoing. During the war, 112 officers conspires against the king. They sent a letter to the Russian Empress Catherine the Great, stating that the war was started illegally by the Swedish king, and that they were willing to make peace after deposing the king. Many of the officers also had personal grievances with the king. In addition to all this, they also demanded that the parliament was to be convened. The king learned of this meeting, and he called it a mutiny. The king felt great despair because of all of this. He spent a few desperate days on his flagship, the Amphion, complaining about everything. He was thinking about abdicating and moving to France. But after a few days, the king gathered himself and started planning how to get out of this situation. And an unexpected solution manifested itself. Denmark declared war on Sweden. One might think that it would have been a catastrophe, a two-front war, but to the king, the Danish declaration of war was the perfect excuse he needed to leave Finland and the situation with the officers, without it looking like he was fleeing. He left the command to his brother and sailed for Sweden. The king managed to gather an army to confront the approaching Danish army near the Gothenburg. However, the war ends after a forced mediation between Sweden and Denmark by foreign powers. Gustav III returns to Stockholm and orders the arrest of the rebellious officers from the Russian war. 97 are sentenced to death, but in the end, only one is executed, and the others are pardoned. When the Danish war is over, Gustav III convened the parliament and the estates, exploiting the hostility towards the nobility in Sweden. Gustav III almost becomes an absolute king through the changing of the constitution. He gains the right to start wars, controls the entire state apparatus, and decides on the composition of the government, resulting in 0 members. Gustav III also begins to abolish the old privileges of the nobility. And for the first time in Sweden's history, positions of power are now available to the broader middle class. Peasants and burghers gain more rights and a stronger position in society. The nobility naturally opposes all these reforms. However, the king manages to gain their approval by marching into the House of Nobles and attending their meetings. At a critical moment during the proceedings, the king seizes the chairman's gavel and pushes through his proposals without a vote. The king continues to reform the Swedish society. He calls himself a revolutionary, though not in the French spirit. The Swedish people begin to love the king more and more, but anger grows among the nobility. Several groups in the Swedish society form to conspire against the king, speaking of the tyrant Gustav III and comparing him to Caesar. The question is whether there is a Brutus in Sweden. During all the mutiny, the Danish war and the king's new powers, the Russian war was still ongoing in the east. The king now wants to end the war against Russia. But in the spring of 1789, the war has yet to reach a conclusion. A year passed with a few battles on land and sea. And in the summer of 1790, the Swedish fleet was trapped near St. Petersburg due to several mistakes, but managed to escape. Near Sveaborg at Svensk Sund, the fleets meet again. The Swedish fleet wins a crucial victory against the Russian fleet. After a short period, peace was concluded with Russia on 14 of August 1790, without any territorial gains, but Sweden had forced Russia to stop intervening in Swedish politics. The king returns to Sweden and is greeted with cheers and a large crowd. All the Russian flags captured in the war are displayed to the public. A statue outside Stockholm Palace depicts Gustav III stepping ashore, symbolizing him as the restorer of peace. Soon, however, the cheers subside. Peace is restored, but it's a fruitless peace, and has only resulted in over 20,000 Swedish deaths in the war. The war has also been devastating for state finances, equivalent to about 6 years of the Swedish state expenses. Now, voices of protest begin to rise from all layers of society. But abroad, the king's reputation grows. In France, the French Revolution is underway, and the king is involved in the plans for the French royal family's escape from Paris. The one organizing the escape is the Swedish Count Axel von Fersen. Gustav III wants to be the monarch who welcomes the French royal couple at the German border. However, none of the escape plans ever succeeded. The ideals of the French Revolution also reached Sweden, resulting in more criticism of Gustav III and his reign. The king is now pressured from all sides in political life. In an attempt to silence revolutionary ideas, the king prohibits Swedish newspapers from writing about what is happening in France. The king becomes increasingly isolated and associated only with a small, loyal group of friends, spending more and more time at Haga Castle. Rumors spread, possibly fueled by his enemies, that the king organized grand orgies in his castle. However, this couldn't be further from the truth. In his solitude, the king devoted his time to reading and planning, envisioning new ambitious projects for the Swedish political system and significant structural developments. An unlikely witness to the king's state at this time emerged. 2 conspirators had stealthily approached the castle to scout for their kidnapping plot against the king. Peering through a window, they observed the king alone, pale-faced, semi-reclining on a sofa, surrounded by books, wearing a white coat and shirt. The sight of the king's pale complexion and white facade frightened the 2 conspirators so much that they hastily retreated from the scene. They were many dreaming about removing the king from his throne. Different groups formed in Swedish society, and some wanted a French-style revolution, while others only wanted to return how things had been before Gustav III's time. Most of these groups consisted of noblemen and men from the middle class. Few had personal grievances with the king. Others were angry to have lost their rights to the king's reforms, or in general just affected them badly. The most serious conspiracy is formed around the 70-year-old political fox Carl Fredrik Peklin. This man had been a part of every political intrigue for decades. He was the one connecting all those hostile to the king and weaving them together. This group attracted, among many, the nobleman Johann Jacob Ankarström, who had begun his career at the Swedish court and then as an officer in the Life Guards. Ankarström had a failed career and found no success in other endeavors in his life. He blames Gustav III for all his setbacks and failures. He also spent some time in prison. He supports his family by acting as a high-interest lender for quick loans. Like many others, he believes it is high time to depose the king. The plans are to carry out a coup and establish a nobility and middle-class friendly government. Peklin pushes the plans forward, and the group manages to gather several prominent nobles and counts, like Horn and Ribbing. These conspirators dream of a new constitution where the nobility regains its lost privileges, but still allows room for reforms inspired by the French Revolution. But most importantly, the king should have no say in the ruling of the country. Shortly after the new year 1792, Ankarström met some of the conspirators at a dinner at Count Horn's estate. Count Horn loathed Gustav III and had big dreams of a different Sweden. Much of his inspiration came from France. The conversation quickly turned to how they could get rid of the king. At the dinner, the idea of carrying out an assassination at the opera was conceived. It was a perfect opportunity to get close to the king without arousing suspicion. One conspirator, Ribbing, asked when and who would consider doing it. Ankarström replied, "If the opportunity arises, I will do it." The conspirators agreed that Ankarström would be the assassin. Already the night after the dinner, Ankarström attended an opera masquerade, but the king did not attend the event. Ankarström was devoted to his task. He tried to assassinate the king no less than 5 times, but he never got close enough to pull the trigger. On Friday, March the 16th, 1792, the final opera masquerade of the season would take place. It was the last chance for Ankarström to make good on his promise to kill the king. Ankarström sat at home in his apartment in Old Town, Stockholm. He sharpened his knife and loaded his pistols. He had bought the knife a week earlier and now painted it black so that it wouldn't shine at the crucial moment. He loaded pistols with shots and scrap metal. At 11:30 p.m., Ankarström left his apartment with his fellow conspirator Count Horn, both dressed for the masquerade. The two men began to walk towards the opera. Ankarström wore a round black hat, a white face mask with a curtain covering the entire face, and was entirely dressed in black. The pistols were tucked in his pockets, and the knife was hidden in his sleeve. The other conspirators had already started to arrive by 11 p.m., and they attracted unwanted attention due to their lack of stealth. Many of the other guests had not yet arrived at the opera, and the conspirators, all dressed the same in mask and black costumes, stood whispering in a corner. Gustav III had dinner in one apartment 1 level up from the ball. When the king finished dinner, he walked to a window and gazed down at the guests. The king had, prior to the masquerade, received an anonymous letter with a warning about an attempt on his life. But he dismissed it as a harmless joke. He said, "Do they think I'm afraid?" Today we know that the letter was written by one of the conspirators, Lieutenant Colonel Liljehorn, member of the Royal Guards. The king then put on a wide silk mantle and adorned his costume with the royal orders. He put on a triangular hat and a white mask covering his entire face, along with the sword. He tucked the letter into his belt and then joined the party and the guests. In spite of his costume, the king was easily recognizable by the other guests, who quickly surrounded him to converse. A man appeared from the crowd and approached Gustav III and put his hand on the king's shoulder. The man said, "Bonsoir, bon masque," which translates to "Good evening, beautiful mask." That utterance was a signal for Ankarström to strike. Ankarström quickly ran up behind the king and fired a shot. Gustav III screamed and said, "Je suis blessé," which means "I am wounded." He was hit above the left hip. He did not fall to the floor or die immediately. The king grabbed his loyal right hand, von Essen, who aided him to a bench where he remained seated for a while. The gunshot had not been very loud and most people didn't notice anything. The orchestra continued to play as if nothing had happened. The lore tells that the conductor had heard something strange and quickly marked on it on the sheet music. According to the lore, the shot was fired just between the 13th and 14th beat of the contradance. The captain of the Royal Guards ran forward and shouted, "Close the doors!" The king became weaker and weaker and asked to be taken to his room. They brought him up and put him in an armchair. Today, you can still see the stiffened blood stains on the chair. Ankarström immediately threw away the pistols and the knife. He and the other conspirators subsequently shouted, "The fire is loose." The idea was to cause panic, but no panic ensued. The doors remained closed. The royal guard now came running from the castle, fully armed, and blocked off the entire opera house. No one could get in, and no one could get out. Stockholm's police chief, Liljesparre, quickly appeared on the scene. He brought out a table and sat down. All the guests had to pass him, take off their masks, and identify themselves. At the same time, Ankarström's pistols and knife were discovered. Nothing according to the conspirators' plan had gone right. The king was not dead, there was no panic, and it could not be a coup because every street and square was patrolled by soldiers. The king was fully conscious and gave clear orders and directives. The police chief discovered in a quick investigation that the pistols had been recently renovated. The next day, he started going around asking among Stockholm's various dealers if anyone recognized them. He got a hit from a blacksmith who recognized them. The pistols had been left by a customer, and that customer was Ankarström. 24 hours after the assassination attempt, Ankarström was arrested and immediately confessed. He claimed that he was alone in the attack. Count Horn's coat was found at Ankarström's home, and he was also arrested. Through the police chief's effective interrogation methods, the conspirators could be arrested one by one. Soon, 30 people were detained and suspected of the assassination attempt. All were high officials and officers. One of them, Count Bjelke, became so nervous when he was called for police interrogation that he took his own life. The king did not understand how serious the injury was, and asked to be carried to his state bedroom at Stockholm Palace. There, he could receive people and make the most of his situation. In the coming days, he was visited by several different people, both friends, relatives, and former enemies. The longer the death struggle lasted, the more sympathy grew for him. The king continued to be fully conscious. He said things like, "Odd that I would be injured in an opera house when I have just returned unscathed from a war." The shots and scraps Ankarström had shot into Gustav III had lodged deeply. Surgeons could not remove the scraps from the king. The court physician had even inserted his entire hand into the wound, but still could not succeed to remove the shrapnel. Witnesses said that the king did not even flinch despite this. However, the wound became increasingly inflamed. On the 14th day, after 13 days of suffering, the king could no longer lie down as it hurt too much. He chose to sit up in a bed or in a chair. The whole room smelled of putrefaction of the wound. The court physician examined and said, "Your Majesty's condition is not satisfactory at all." The king then asked, "Is it serious?" The doctor replied, "Yes. My conscience and honor forbid me to deny it." The king then asked, "How much time is left?" The doctor replied, 5 or 6 hours. The king then took the last sacrament. Gustav I's last words in life were, "I feel sleepy. A short moment of rest would do me good." The king died on March 29, 1792, at the age of 46. He died at the palace surrounded by a small group of friends. Neither the queen nor the king's brother, Duke Karl, was present. After the king's death, the brother Duke Karl took over in a regency government. Karl ordered the police chief Liljesparre to close the investigation for the murder and complain against his late brother. The reason given was that the conspiracy thread grew too long and high in society. Who knows, maybe all the way to the royal house. Duke Karl had been in contact with dissatisfied officials and officers for several years. Probably he knew about the assassination attempt, but not when it would happen. Of the accused conspirators, only one, Ankarström, was executed. All others had their sentences shortened or were pardoned by Duke Karl. The mentioned counts were sentenced to exile. Ankarström became the most public execution in Sweden's history. During the 3 days, he was taken to 3 squares in Stockholm, where he was publicly whipped. On April 27, he was taken to the gallows in Stockholm. He was taken there in a cart. He was completely calm and read from his prayer book. Sometimes he looked up and greeted acquaintances. His last words were, "Praise and honor be to you, Lord Jesus, sincerely." The executioner then chopped off his right hand, the hand that had held the pistol, and then beheaded him. The body was chopped into several parts. The innards were put in a bag and buried. His head and body parts were put on a spike, and there it stayed for several weeks. The death of Gustav III was not only an eclipse of an era, but also an eclipse and a decline in Swedish cultural enlightenment for a long time.